We are today on this Tuesday, approaching reset day in NA already, and tomorrow in EU. We are on our weekly recap of Mythic Plus. Now, what is happening at the same time of the recap of Mythic Plus is, of course, the MDI tournament. Now, spoiler alert, this weekend we just had the ending of the first bracket of the MDI. In a couple of days there will be the second bracket of the MDI. A few interesting things happened. We might have a video about it later on, but what mattered most is just thinking if the picks of these top Mythic Plus players in the MDI were going to impact the normies, to impact the more average player base on what these guys were doing. For example, many players right now are not too familiar with seeing, for example, many Destruction Warlocks or Shadow Priests, for example, in their keys compared to what you're seeing here in most of the keys having these two specs present, for example. However, going on, what has been happening down is in this week of Mythic Plus, which is also a relevant week because, as we mentioned before, Tyrannical Storming and Raging is, statistically speaking, the easiest Tyrannical week of the season. Now, as we have at this point looked at multiple times, we have the hilarious combination of these two specs outdoing everyone else when it comes to top results, even though their average damage remains good but not the best. In case of Shadow and Destruction, their overall top highest damage is still, and it has been now for at least like 3 weeks or so, has been the highest, has progressively risen to be the highest in terms of overall maximum damage in keys. This one being, of course, the reason why it's being brought so much to these lower keys compared to the top level keys done by now. These tournament keys are at plus 22, plus 23 level. So you can make mega pools, which means the larger your AoE potential, the better, and Shadow and Destruction happen to have a very high, large AoE potential compared to a few other specs which are way more capped in the amount of AoE they can do. For example, Outlaw, you see their top damage is amongst the weakest ones, even across the ones at the top, due to their limitations of Blade Flurry, for example. Still though, we are now at a point in the meta where we have seen for well over a month since the rise of Retribution Paladin to be the top spec, which has now been going on for basically, 4 weeks at this point. This has had some ramifications in the meta. You know, up to a few weeks ago, RET was a healthy, viable, possible alternative, and then in the past month it has really picked up as a significant option for the top keys at the expense of Havoc. This is not something we were used to. If we were to look at the start of the season, Havoc and Augmentation were the two main picks in Mythic Plus. Many people were looking, many players would be looking for these two specs, and now things seem to have turned upside down. Augmentation has gone to low enough level that is now matching a Shadow Priest in terms of popularity, as well as Havoc losing so much that they are now being overtaken by Outlaw, not to mention Retribution Paladin over doubling their representation. Now, whenever we talk about Mythic Plus, it's always worth mentioning that these are just the top keys, which means, you know, anywhere from plus 27-ish onwards, and not the super high level maximum top high keys, right? Because at this level the meta will be different. As you can see here, the amount of RET Paladins present is like 2, and that's still the same guy, right? There's way more Havoc Demon Hunter players than there are RET Paladin players at high key levels. But you do see, for example, that even Havoc is starting to lose its presence in high keys. If you go to the melee DPS and you start looking at, you know, plus 25 and onwards, they are very head to head, and then if you go to the 30 and up, you still see them very close head to head, but the number gets significantly reduced. You see here 86 and 70. Compare this to the presence of the range DPS. 195, 77, 215. These numbers are wildly higher than the numbers of the melee DPS, meaning that the top level keys will have more range DPS than they have melee DPS at the moment. Now, what could be the cause for this? Because at the end of the day, if you look at the meta of Mythic Plus, it's not that we have gotten some massive balance tuning since basically a month. This was precisely our last set of balance tuning on January the 23rd, which is basically almost a month ago. And most of the specs you will see in here have not really made that many strides in becoming meta. Because, for example, Feral was being buffed, Unholy DK, Frost DK, Blood DK, you had Survival Hunter, you had Holy Paladin, Holy Priest, Resto Shaman, Arms Warrior. When you go and look at their presence in the meta, these names don't really pop up anywhere. Even if you look at the damage, we have covered some of the increases in damage, for example, of Arms, of Unholy, over time compared to, you know, several weeks ago. Before receiving buffs, they were lower down, now they went a little bit further up, but nothing to make them super meta, right? The only major changes in terms of balance tuning from a month ago were to Shadow, number 1, and to Ret Paladin, number 2. Those were the ones that actually did see some improvements. This was the time of the balance tuning, right over this gap. Players saw the buffs given to Shadow, saw the buffs given to Ret, and that's where the play rate of these specs started to rise over time. Now, many players often have this idea that when it comes to becoming a meta spec, especially when it comes to the DPS, what is the most important thing? It doesn't even matter about your survivability, your defensives, your crowd control, your damage profile. The one thing that matters is big, thick, turgid, long dick when it comes to DPS, when it comes to the one who does the most damage, right? If you do the most damage, then you will be meta. Now, what has been happening in the past few weeks is that Ret Paladin has been out-damaging Havoc Demon Hunter, and that compared to the early parts of the season, Outlaw Rogue has also gotten closer, much closer, to Havoc Demon Hunter over time. Right? Now, what has been happening in the meta is that also Outlaw, compared to Havoc, Outlaw itself has remained more or less on the same number throughout the season. Havoc has not. Ret has not. Now you've gotten to the point where Havoc is being passed, matched by Outlaw and passed by Ret, which is also what we are seeing in the damage. Almost matched by Outlaw and passed by Ret. And this power mostly comes almost exclusively from the very simply, the increase in damage in Ret Paladin. It doesn't even matter about the utility brought by a Havoc Demon Hunter, the fact that they have an immunity, the fact that they have AoE CC or other things that they may bring. What was the thing, you know? The thing at the start of the season was the damage. Outlaw was there for the damage. So once you go on long enough where your damage is no longer that powerful, you start looking at other specs, like in this case, Ret Paladin. Now, there is also the other point, which is sometimes, definitely, you do want to look at your group composition for what they can bring to a key. And even in that angle, even from that perspective, things are not positive for Havoc, because guess what's happening when it comes to tanks? Well, what's been happening when it comes to tanks is that up until Ret was not being buffed, Protection Paladin was actually fighting head-to-head at a reasonable amount, at a reasonable 50-50 with Vengeance. So, you know, the popularity of a Prot Paladin tank made it so that having a Havoc Demon Hunter would give you all of the utility, all of the benefits of having a Demon Hunter in your group. And it also made it so that having a Ret Paladin together with a Prot Paladin wasn't that necessary, since most of the good stuff brought by a Ret Paladin could be brought by a Prot Paladin. However, in the past few weeks, without any particular changes to Vengeance or changes to Protection Paladin, Vengeance has been taking over. Vengeance has been now the vastly more popular of the two tanks. If you go back to the meta over here, this is the 30 and up keys. There is 232 Vengeance Demon Hunters versus 29. It's almost 10 times, you know, it's 9 times as many Vengeance Demon Hunter tanks than Protection Paladins. So now you're entering a situation in high Mythic Plus keys where almost every key will have a Vengeance Demon Hunter, meaning the need of a Havoc Demon Hunter is much reduced, and most keys now won't have a Prot Paladin, meaning having a Ret Paladin in your key will now come in handy way more. So if now having more damage wasn't enough to make Ret Paladin more worthwhile than Havoc Demon Hunter, now you also have the fact that you lack a Prot Paladin, which means having a Ret Paladin is even more valuable. Do we want to go even deeper than this? Guess who has a Combatress in your group? Well, Druid has a Combatress, it's not very meta. Well, Warlock has a Combatress, it's not very meta. Druid has a combat res, it's also not very meta, which means guess who also has a combat res? A Ret Paladin. So this trio of combination, the loss of protection paladin in the meta, which fueled the group's lack of combat res, plus the buffs of Ret Paladin coupled with more and more Ret Paladins getting their hands on the legendary, ended up giving them more damage, and all together made it so that now Ret Paladin is being used and is now more present than a Havoc Demon Hunter. That's the evolution in the DPS meta in the last few weeks at this point. You know, this has changed quite a lot. If you consider what we started with, the first almost 2 months of the season, we have went upside down with the popularity of Ret, Shadow and Fire. You know, we went from 4, 5 and 1 to 22, 18 and 10. Those are massive increases. Fire increased by almost 6 times, Ret increased by almost 4 times, and Shadow increased by 10 times as much as before. So very, very big change in the viability of DPS specs given by buffs or nerfs or both, right? Something that did not happen quite as much when it comes to tanks and healers. In fact, if you look at the number for variety, for variance, for diversity, where the lower the number, the better, because it means you have more options, you can see that the tank number has progressively gotten worse and worse and worse and worse because of this. Right, it has now fully reached Exodia level of popularity of a Guardian Druid. The healer one you can also see getting progressively worse, because Mistweaver is progressively growing in popularity compared to the other 2 specs, which used to be neck and neck before, now not nearly as much. Meanwhile, the only one who did change positively is the DPS one, who started out much more strict in the popularity of just 2 specs, and then over time went to become more flexible on multiple options. So we have gotten an improvement when it comes to the variety of the DPS, not nearly as much when it comes to tanks and when it comes to healers, who have now gotten a way more fixed power of the same specs over time. A lot of times results like these might feel somewhat unfair for many players, because when you look at the damage and you are, for example, a Beast Mastery Hunter or a Windwalker Monk, and you look at your damage and you're like, well, you know what, I'm kind of good, yeah, I'm doing okay. My damage is actually beating 80% of all of the other DPS, right? You're doing well. So you kind of ask yourself then like, why is nobody playing me? You know, why am I below 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 specs, even 9 with Fury, 9 specs? You know, I am supposed to be like 6th and 7th. Why am I below so many more specs? That is where the more minute details can start to come into play. Like, for example, Beast Mastery Hunter being very squishy can be a factor in the choice of your group, or Windwalker Monk not having nearly as much single target damage, or Windwalker Monk not bringing enough new stuff now that you consider Mistweaver being already a popular pick, not needing the utility of a Windwalker Monk, for example. That's where those things can start to come into play. And then, of course, you also have the base popularity of each specs based on the parses. For example, you see that Beast Mastery is still a very used spec, despite not being nearly as powerful, simply because players just like to play hunters. You know, just at any level, right? This is the super competitive level where BM is very, very low, but if you go at all keys, there you go. There's the super popularity of Beast Mastery Hunter. Even if you go into the 20 level, Beast Mastery is still first. Even in the 25 level, Beast Mastery still has a pretty good number of players playing the spec. Almost 3 times as high as Shadow Priest. And then as soon as things become actually, you know, world first high level MDI tier competitive, Shadow Priest is the one that becomes, you know, 5 times as big, 4 times as big as Beast Mastery. It just gets turned upside down. Even more visible the current set of changes by looking at the most popular compositions in this week, so the comps you are more likely to see day in, day out in Mythic Plus keys, or perhaps in the Looking for Group Finder as you are declined, because everyone is trying to go for these comps and you're not part of these picks. Full dominance of Vengeance. We mentioned a few weeks ago how Prot Paladin was about to go extinct. They went from 2 picks of Prot to just 1 pick of Prot, and now they have just gone out of the radar in terms of most popular picks. Discipline is losing more and more from a more dominant position of a while ago to a more mixed set of options. Full dominance of fire, almost another full line here of ret. Only one balanced druid showing up now, 3 shadow priests, 2 havoc demon hunters. That is the clear divide now, fire, ret, and then a bunch of random stuff in between, which is consistent with what we have seen here. Fire, ret, and a bunch of stuff far lower down to alternate. All in all, it's still a pretty healthy situation when it comes to the meta and the stuff you can play in the game, from healers to DPS. The tanks are currently the one in the worst situation when it comes to the power of vengeance. We will see, of course, with our last bit of copium, what's gonna happen in 10.2.6, since we don't know what changes are gonna come, because this is going to be a secret patch that won't go through the PTR, meaning we won't see any changes until the day we log into the game and we have the patch notes being released. Maybe 10.2.6 will bring some balance tuning, but we don't know, and we won't know for about a couple more weeks. The patch is supposed to come out early March, so it's not that long away, but for now, this is the situation when it comes to Mythic Plus, as we, I guess, wait for any more changes, perhaps any more surprise things being brought forth by the MDI, although that's gonna be doubtful, since the Group B of the MDI should likely run more or less the same comps we have seen in Group A, so not many more surprises should happen when it comes to the specs being used, but that's what's coming in the next few days when it comes to the Mythic Plus environment. So for today, on this Tuesday, we are saying goodbye to each other. We are starting, of course, by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, of course, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, well, it's one of those times where I get to make a video late at night. Doesn't happen often, but you know, it's like 3 AM right now. It's pretty cool, at least for the silence around me.